While you're working, I'll do the introductions. So I'm happy to introduce Katerina Symes, who's a PhD candidate in communication studies at Concordia as well. She's also faculty in humanities at Vanier College. Her research is supported by Shirk. She is a co-author, along with Krista Genevieve Leitz,
yes, yeah,
of Cyborgs and Virtual Bodies in the Oxford Handbook of Feminist Theory. And she's also the author of Orange is the New Black, the popularization of lesbian sexuality and heterosexual modes of viewing in feminist media studies. The forthcoming article, Orange is the New Black, Menstruation, Comedy, and the Unruly Feminine, can be found in the edited collection, Menstruation Now, What Does Blood Perform? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the unnecessary introduction. If I knew this conference was going to be a little bit more chill, I would have definitely abbreviated it. But on paper, it sounds pretty good, so I'll keep it. I'd also like to begin with a plug for Tuca and Birdie. I just finished it last night. It's actually so good. So I definitely highly recommend it. So yes, the title of my presentation today is An Invitation to Watch Digital Television, Paratext, and Queer Crossover Programs. So today I'll be looking at a selection of promotional materials from 3 different programs. Orange is the New Black, Transparent, and Her Story. And I'll be specifically examining how these paratexts address different audiences, particularly in their circulation. Hopefully most of you are familiar with Orange and Transparent by this point, as these series come to an end. Anyone watch Her Story? This is not surprising. It's a really small kind of indie web series on YouTube. If you have an hour to kill, it's 6 episodes. It's really great, so it's a quick crush. I definitely recommend that one. But with that series, it essentially just focuses on the dating lives of trans women, queer and trans women. So it's kind of a unique little piece. So before I dive into it, I usually like to begin by giving a little background context on how I come to my projects. So this one is very much a work in progress. I'm really stoked to hear your feedback after. But certainly I'm a fan of these programs, surprise. And I started watching Orange way back in 2013, shortly after it was released on Netflix. So it was definitely recommended as a title in the algorithm based on my viewing preferences. Okay, so I rewatched Weeds and this popped up. But what actually tipped me over into watching Orange was this academic and popular fervor surrounding the series. So that's kind of what led me to this program, and it kind of snowballed there into watching these other 2 programs as well. Now, in this academic fervor, there was one particular review that stood out to me, and it was by Emily Nussbaum, who, of course, is the television critic for The New Yorker. And she described in her review Orange as being a smart, salty, and outrageous, and she praised Netflix as this worthy rival to cable. And these associations, of course, between Netflix and quality TV have since become quite synonymous with Netflix is sort of positioned as this game-changing or transformational force within the industry. What actually struck me about this particular review was that she called Orange essentially this love child between Oz and the L Word. So it was 2 completely different shows. You had one that was about this quite graphic, violent drama about a men's prison, and then of course the L Word, which is about the dating lives of women living in LA. Lesbian and queer women living in LA. So in this sense, I thought it was really interesting that she made these links between the 2. So it was positioned as this worthy replacement for those still ravenous for queer representation since the L Word ended. But at the same time, it was appealing enough to people who wouldn't necessarily seek out queer content explicitly. So there seemed to me to be this invitational structure, or this ability for the show to appeal to larger audiences. And it was being discussed in a way that I simply just haven't seen before at the time. So I kind of wondered, what's happening here? Why now? And why specifically this program? Now, since Orange, there's of course been a proliferation of digital TV programs engaging with queer and trans content, which include Transparent and Her Story. And all of these series have some commonalities, right? So they feature ensemble casts, and their characters, they include a range of body types and identities, right? So you have characters from overlapping sexual, gender, racial, ethnic identities. And the representational politics of these shows, well, they actually extend to the production of them as well, too. So many of these series, they actually employ, queer and trans people as writers, directors, actors, content creators, and even crew members. So the inclusion of trans people and queer people in all facets of the production of these programs was meant to reflect this unprecedented level of diversity within the industry. And subsequently, a lot of fans, critics, academics alike, well, we've kind of celebrated these programs as offering more complex portrayals of queer and trans characters or queer and trans life. So these shows have definitely been described as bold, transgressive, or even revolutionary. And these programs exemplify how queer and trans content is something that viewers want and need. And they've certainly reinvigorated these debates surrounding, again, queer and trans visibility, but they've also demonstrated some of the affordances of online and mobile and digital media. So for me, I think queer and trans characters have, to some degree, have always been on television, but certainly this recent proliferation reflects the confluence of, I think, three specific factors. So the first, obviously, is television's changing modes of production, distribution, and consumption. So, of course, this recent move towards online streaming that's happened within the last 5 years or so. The second, of course, is now there is this popularity and critical acclaim received by these works that have centered queer and trans life or queer and trans characters or have featured these themes in their series. Finally, the third factor I would say is there is this growing need within popular and public discourse to have queer and trans people tell their own stories. So I think these three factors are quite significant to the time that we're living in with digital TV proliferating in the way that it has. Now, because these shows are positioned at this historical juncture, I think that they offer different ways of knowing and representing queer and trans life. So on the one hand, they of course make space for queer and trans audiences within dominant and popular culture. So viewers don't have to look for the hidden signs of or codes of queerness because it's featured front and center, which I think is kind of cool in a way. At the same time, on the other hand, right, these shows are also appealing to those who wouldn't necessarily actively seek out queer content. So you have people who would, they'd watch Orange, maybe it's recommended as part of the algorithmic software that Netflix uses, but they wouldn't necessarily go to a queer film festival. So again, it's this kind of invitational structure, so this ability for these shows to address a larger category of viewership that I find super compelling. And it's part of the reason why I've termed these programs queer crossovers. So it's meant to sort of imply this dynamic relationship as these shows challenge or renegotiate the boundaries between and within audiences and genres and that kind of thing. And this invitational structure, it operates in these three shows in various different ways. So it actually works at the level of aesthetics, its narrative, as well as the ways in which these shows introduce its characters. But for today, I think I'm just going to focus on how the structure works at the paratextual level. Ooh, not quite yet. So paratexts as guiding materials have been well covered by TV studies, right? So Jonathan Gray has argued that television has never been just TV. And so given the extended presence of things like, trailers, promotional materials, fan merchandise, that kind of stuff, you really can't examine television without considering its multiple proliferations. And paratexts are, of course, important sites of strategic industrial practices. So they're purposely deployed by marketers and distributors to capture wider audiences. Now, at the same time, their significance extends beyond these promotional or monetary terms. So official posters, trailers, and press reviews, they are meant to guide our entry into series, right? So they set up these strategies for interpretation to help us engage in the viewing process or to make sense of it. Now, as these conceptual framing devices, paratexts shape our expectations about a particular series. So a lot of us engage with more paratexts than we do necessarily with shows. And yesterday in the roundtable, Julia Himberg talked about this, this proliferation of so much content, not all of us being able to watch it all. So I think in some ways still looking at paratexts is important because, again, a lot of us kind of know what these shows are about, some of the political interventions that they're making without necessarily watching them explicitly. So yeah, I mean, in the age of digital television, probably some of you are like, well, why paratexts? Why are we still looking at paratexts? But aren't people coming to these shows through recommendations from friends, word of mouth, social media, or these algorithmic functions? But again, I still think that's certainly true. But these texts still remain these key sites of negotiation for queer crossovers in this particular moment. And it's in these paratexts that I think you can see this tension play out between a program's specific industry attachments, so these assumptions about who is watching, alongside its possibilities for queer and trans representation. So many scholars have noted how paratexts perform a double work. So on the one hand, paratexts have the potential to, close down or domesticate meaning from specific textual decodings. As Andre Cavalcante suggests, because paratexts operate on the textual periphery, they neutralize and domesticate potential threats a narrative poses to either a social or a status quo. So for instance, in Brookie and Westerfeld-House's discussion of same-sex desire in film, they actually talk about how paratexts can function as a digital closet. So for instance, in representations of homoeroticism, paratexts can actually serve to deny that homoeroticism represents homosexuality, or even deny homosexuality altogether because it simply redirects a viewer's attention elsewhere. Now, at the same time, paratexts can also validate and affirm queer and trans life, right? So they have the ability to incite these wider cultural conversations around representations of gender and sexuality, particularly for those people who don't necessarily come or watch these programs. So for Cavalcante, he really suggests that paratexts reflect a cultural ambivalence of this incorporation of queer and trans life into dominant and popular culture. And I find this idea of cultural ambivalence really, really compelling, but for me, it's my starting point. So I think when you look at paratexts, there's definitely this temptation to be like, okay, how does it sort of normalize or contain queer representations, which is really interesting, but at the same time, too, I feel like in examining the different kinds of paratexts a show uses, as the seasons progress, as they circulate, it has the ability to, I think, address different questions. So for me, in examining these different types of paratexts, I'm able to sort of address the implications of these differences, particularly in the circulation and in how they address multiple audiences. So let's look at some of these. Ooh. So I started here with a selection of season 1 posters from each of these 3 shows. And at first glance, it's really easy to see how queerness is sort of being domesticated, right? Certainly with Orange, you have Piper visually centered. Her queerness is certainly contained by the fact that she's sort of a blonde white lady. You kind of have Nikki and Morello in the background. Their position is quite secondary, right? But again, their queerness is sort of contained within the space of the prison, right? It's situated sort of within this lesbian pornographic narrative of the lesbian prison fantasy, which is quite common within mainstream pornography. Transparent, on the other hand, right, you have the framing of trans identity within the context of the heteronormative family. So I think certainly with the images being these squares, it's meant to sort of suggest like a photo album or even a fractured identity. And certainly with her story as well, too, you have these 2 trans characters and a queer woman, but the trans characters readily pass, and it's sort of represented within these confines of romance and love. So again, really easy to make this kind of like critique or assessment of these paratexts. But I think for me, originally, when you look at this, if you watch these programs, you know that the narrative eventually complicates some of these representations. So here you can definitely see the narrative being subjugated to the needs of the distributor. But again, what's interesting is if you kind of delve a little bit deeper and consider how these paratexts iterate when the shows circulate themselves. So if we kind of move on from here with Orange, its extra televisual elements have circulated widely, right? So actors have been featured in pride parades, there's a ton of fan wikis and Tumblrs, and you can pretty much follow anyone on Twitter, okay? And even at one point, you could score free chocolate and vanilla swirl ice cream cones from the Crazy Pies food truck, which of course is named after one of the series' popular characters, Suzanne Warren. A little bit inappropriate, I think, but that's kind of one of the iterations of this show. And for me, when you see this collection of other paratexts, you can see that even in the original poster, there's like little being domesticated here. Certainly Orange is being framed as this catch-all series, right? It's riding off the backbones of Cohan's success with Weeds. So it's meant to appeal to those who, have watched Weeds, right? Who would have the show recommended to them in their algorithmic software, maybe are fans of prison dramas, that kind of thing. But it is meant to appeal to this larger demographic. And the interesting thing as well, too, is Orange isn't positioned as an explicitly queer series in the same way that Transparent and Her Story are. So I think that distinction is quite important as well. So of course, it's unsurprising with Transparent that as the show circulates, you see different uses of paratexts. So I want to talk a bit about their Transparent's 2015 Emmy campaign. They used a two-pronged approach. The first was a series of traditional billboards, and it's very similar to the first promotional poster. So you see trans identity being framed within the context of the family unit. So enjoy a family dinner, call your mappa, that kind of thing. But alongside this approach, there was a second one, and it was a guerrilla marketing campaign. And it included this sticker with the series hashtag #BeTransparent. And essentially, participating restaurants in LA allowed people to come in and post this sticker on their single-stalled bathrooms, making them, in effect, gender neutral. So you can see already that this particular ad is an explicit political intervention in public space, right? And it really foregrounds what Halberstam refers to as the bathroom problem. So it makes visible the ways in which public spaces like washrooms are places where things like gender are policed and reinforced. At the same time, who is this addressed to, right? Who is unfamiliar with the bathroom problem? Well, it tends to be people who are largely cisgender. So you can see that there is this address to larger audiences in the paratext with this show, but with Transparent, in comparison to Orange, is decidedly pedagogical, right? It's got this educational component to it as well. Her Story, it was only one season. It was hoping to get picked up, but unfortunately it hasn't. So its selection of promotional materials are actually quite limited. But I think it's worth noting that with this particular poster, all of its media is available for free to download through its website. And this definitely aligns too with the commitment based on the writers and producers to have the show be made available for free online via YouTube. The show also received support from an Indiegogo funding campaign, and in the campaign as well too, there was a different tiers of rewards where viewers could receive different types of fan merchandise or meet and greet with the cast and crew members based on their contribution amount. And I think with this show, right, certainly Her Story's commitment to online accessibility, it reflects the growing influence of digital media within trans communities, right? And Cavalcante has also published on this as well. He talks about how, new technology, and these online mediated spaces are increasingly becoming important spaces for trans people. So in looking at all three, I was kind of like, well, what's happening here, right? All these shows have this multiple address. There is this appeal to larger audiences, but they're definitely going about it in very, very different ways. And again, my preliminary conclusion at this point is that these shows are obviously positioned within very different politics of representation, okay? And this seems like an obvious conclusion or an obvious statement, but I actually think it's one that gets lost within this larger discourse of quality TV, right? We tend to frame things like Netflix and Amazon Video as being these benevolent giants. So the idea is that, okay, if you produce your show on one of these platforms, you don't have to make the same types of representational concessions to advertisers, like was the case before in commercial broadcasting. So therefore, it explains why we have this proliferation of queer content, queer and trans content now. But I would say that, again, to reference the roundtable from yesterday, Lynn talked a little bit about how we tend to speak in these logics of television without realizing it. And I think this discourse of quality TV is absolutely one of them. Okay, so there's absolutely this spotlighting of queer and trans lives on TV, partly a result of this proliferation of digital television. But again, these trajectories are slightly different. So in the case of Transparent and Her Story, right, these shows are, again, positioned as explicitly queer, and they're situated within this long lineage of other series where, you know, it's engaging with trans characters and themes, but they've largely been told by cisgender creators or portrayed by cisgender actors. So it's not surprising if you look at the paratexts then, given the fact that trans self-representation has become this cornerstone, that it has this sort of pedagogical slant to it, or there's this attempt to include the audiences that it represents. And I think also for me too, just to conclude as well, in doing this kind of cross comparison between programs, right, we can sort of see the smaller interventions that these shows are making. So this larger discourse of quality TV kind of elides or obscures that a little bit. And again, Julia Himberg yesterday talked a little bit about the implications of queer and trans visibility given this proliferation of digital media and digital television programming. And I think in examining the circulation of these shows, so what happens to them as they iterate and are around for a while, it might be the beginning to sort of answer this question, right? So yes, there's a lot of shows out there, maybe not everyone's watching, but if we examine their circulation, if we examine the network in which they're building alongside one another together, we can actually see that they're responding to one another in particular ways and making these small interventions. And again, this network I think is one that sort of gets elided by simply just saying, hey, Netflix came along and really just raised the bar in terms of what's possible for queer representation. I'll leave it there. Thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And
Hey.
I really like paratexts, and I really think that they are still very important in digital viewing practices. Thinking about paratexts and queer theory, which is deeply linked to a postmodern, multiplicity, fragmented worldview. I was wondering if what you just showed was more an idea of paratext that reinforces one dominant view or a positioning in the market that is interesting for Amazon, for Netflix, for the distributors and the producers. Whereas at the same time, we could also think paratext as a way to complexify the text. So I'm wondering if there are other examples, or if in the examples that you show, because it's interesting to see how they work for activism, but at the same time you think, okay, every restaurant in LA is gonna basically advertise for Amazon.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what's in the back of the idea. But at the same time, maybe, is there any other way to think of paratext, or maybe a more extended conception of paratext as a tool to make the experience of the show more queer, because more complex, because what I like, for example, in Transparent, that everybody seems to hate, is actually not the fact that the character is trans, but what's going on around the dismantling of the family, and what's all the characters questioning themselves and complexifying season by season. Or even Orange, the flashbacks, the fact that the text is always going to add or to work in between the seasons, with multiplicity, so I was wondering if paratexts work also in that direction. I mean, what you show is great, and I really see how it's linked to these framing devices that are still very important, but are there other examples, or?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. The thing that comes to mind is Orange is the New Black, because that's like the one that I'm absolutely the most familiar with. And certainly I'm focusing here on the sort of more official paratexts, or stuff that's like actually being produced by the distributors. So again, with the Crazy Pies food truck or their season 1 promotional poster. I haven't done too much into this yet, but there's a lot of sort of fan paratexts being created to sort of negotiate and challenge, again, what the distributor is framing as necessary. So with Orange, ones you have in the first poster there, Piper's centering as this particular character, right? And a lot of people hate Piper. Like, she's the worst character on that show, right? She's awful. So it's interesting that the distributor is like, okay, let's try and make this a total catch-all. This is our target demographic for a show that has some queer content in it. But people are coming in with their own sort of fan interpretations to renegotiate it because of this centering of her character. So they're creating fanfic and trying to displace her character a little bit and focusing on other narratives. So absolutely, for sure. And I think doing that, opening up, as you suggest, sort of allows this like complex negotiation between what the distributor wants, or the idea of who the target demographic is, along with, you know, what are people actually doing this in its circulation. So yeah, it's definitely more than the circulation of these texts, but what people sort of do with them when they take it and read it and go from there. So cool, thank you for that. That's useful.
There's a question in the back, and then after.
Yes, as an uneducated person, I was wondering how could the internet impact of everything could go along the fourth feminist wave.
Can you explain a little bit more, kind of like what you mean by that?
Well, I'm talking a lot with my friends, everybody that I know all the time, and we're talking a lot about this fourth feminist wave that come to overthrow the internet, that tries to break more and more of the pre-established order, and I'm wondering what kind of this, how can we relate those two mainstream shows to something that's more cultural and communal and intimate versus the mega productions of companies and whatever.
I think it's a paradox of a lot of shows that we've discussed yesterday and today. It's a very, even just being a queer professor in the university.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's complicated.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you can.
I know. This is sort of like the paradox is, oh my god, yeah. The paradox is sort of like the defining feature of the conference. You both talked about yesterday in your sort of opening speech, and like even in the opening roundtable, which I loved, it was referenced as well too. And I think what was really inspiring is, again, in the presenters, when you guys were sharing, talked about this need to develop like a new language to talk about these things, because we're sort of stuck in how do we discuss, so we need to develop a new type of language. And I think here that maybe in this project there's like the start of trying to develop a methodology for analyzing these shows as well too, because I think we do get kind of caught up in being like, all right, these shows each offer this rich microcosm for analysis. They have their own characters, their backstories, their own fan communities. So we tend to focus on them as sort of like isolated incidents, which is great because I love textual analysis, I love discourse analysis. But at the same time too, it's so much more than that right now. So there is this like, we need to talk about the industry and the political economic factors that are happening and how those decisions trickle down to what narratives get told, how the characters are represented as well too. And then with that textual analysis, later, as you're saying, with the circulation of these programs, like what are the proliferations surrounding these texts? And then later, how do they get taken up by actual people who are watching them in ways that are unintended or unanticipated by viewers itself? And I feel like now in this moment, it's not just like, oh yeah, digital TV is doing it for us, great, where queers are in the mainstream now, it's all fine and dandy. That's not true at all, right? So I think you need to sort of do this like four-pronged approach to really sort of lay the land of what's happening, and maybe that's the start of a methodology for how to analyze queer crossovers or something like that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, if I just like artfully dodged it, but okay.
You dodged it, but you dodged it well enough.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So I am. So I'm interested in this notion of the queer crossover, and in some ways, it sounds, and I may very well be misreading you or misunderstanding you, and please correct me if I am, but it sounds as if you're suggesting that this is a somewhat new phenomena. Is that true?
I mean, this iteration of it with the rise of digital TV.
Okay, because part of what I'm sort of interested in is, because I don't actually necessarily believe that digital is the thing that's different. I think it's in some ways our access to paratexts. So in other words, like we can actually go all the way back to the 1970s, and as Ron Becker's Gay TV and Straight America does, and talks about the ways that the the sophistication of the Nielsen ratings sort of starts to give rise to our televisual over-reliance on 18 to 34-year-olds, which he ultimately argues gives rise to what Entertainment Weekly ends up calling the gay 90s. And so Will and Grace is actually never, for instance, Will and Grace is never necessarily meant for queers. It's actually meant for the slumpy demographic that he talks about, 18 to 34-year-olds who are sort of hip and cool for watching this kind of content. And so in some ways, this is the same thing that's happening, or I would argue at least, the same thing that's happening with Orange is the New Black. And so I'm wondering if really what's different is the ways that we can actually access paratexts and not necessarily the idea of the queer crossover.
This is actually really a compelling question. I'm gonna take a minute just to think about it.
Yes, can I ask a question? Because it's part of the way that we're able to access those paratexts is through like digital media though, like.
Right, but it is suggesting though, when I mention digital, what it's suggesting is that Netflix or Amazon is doing something different. And essentially what Amazon and Netflix are doing is they have just transferred the quality audience, the 18 to 34-year-old, into online spaces. So in other words, like they're not necessarily doing sort of radical content for radical queers. They're actually, because Netflix, as much as the internet is supposed to be this amazing space, the internet is actually only and always about making money. And so as soon as the views for Orange is the New Black go down, it doesn't matter what it's doing for queer representation. That shit's getting the axe.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
You wanted to add something?
No, I'm
No.
just agreeing with everything you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that is part of this discourse of quality TV that's attached to online streaming, though. It's supposed to is framed as this force that it's doing all these great things as well. But I think when then you peel that away from the surface, you kind of realize that, well, I don't know, that's not necessarily how it's going. So if you break it down, I think you look at these shows specifically and what they're doing across, again, this political economic analysis in its textual analysis, in its narratives, that kind of thing. And then later on, its proliferations with the fan communities. I think it's making these smaller interventions, not these sort of grandiose, like, hey, this is like a new thing. Look, queers are all of a sudden on TV as a result of digital television. I think it's much more interesting to look at the smaller interventions that it's making. So with Transparent, for instance, and with, again, the use of these paratexts, or even with Her Story as well, too. Her Story is a really good example because it does have this like pedagogical lean to it as well. So it's quite unusual in representing trans life in a way that we haven't seen on TV. So you have like, kisses are quite intimate with one another. But at the same time, too, it's framed in a way where it's meant to appeal to this larger demographic. So to me, I think maybe it's like this pedagogical lean that becomes much more significant and might be a little bit different because it's supposed to be appealing to a multiple demographic. So again, it's for like, more straight identified or mainstream audiences, but also queer audiences as well. But then again, it has this educational component as much as it is meant to be like, hey, look at these different types of representations that we haven't seen before. So that would be my preliminary, answer to that. So.
All right.
There are clips of Transparent that were shared on Facebook, actually, during, I don't know, season 2 and 3 or 4.
Yeah.
With actually all the members of the family that won a ticket to go to a shrink.
Yeah.
And so they all go to the shrink, and you see each one is like very short clips that were shared on Facebook. So that's, maybe that answers my question.
Sure. Yeah. Cool. Sweet. Thank you so much. Appreciate
All
it.
right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.